What I'd like to do today, I want to do something more medical because you're all going to be doctors. I want to talk somewhat about the beginning of medicine in, of course, the Greek world. I want to talk about the Hippocratic Oath, and I want to talk about grace. So that song, Amazing Grace, is very appropriate. And I want to say, in some sense, what's interesting about the Bible, about the New Testament, it's not only what's in it, but what's not in it. And I want to show you something that's not in the New Testament, sort of surprisingly so for a philosopher. But when we think about it, then I think we can understand the importance of something like grace and how important grace is for the ultimate Christian virtue, which is, of course, what we're here today and yesterday about, which is love. So first of all, I had a question from yesterday. So I have a couple of questions, and I've talked to a lot of people. So I just wanted to start off by answering a few quick questions. And let's just start with this. So this is, I enjoyed the couch session yesterday. It's great as a philosopher. In the university, we're all theoretical, and we all talk about these abstract ideas, and it's great to see professionals that are working, sitting there and have concrete, practical situations and have to bring their thought, their faith to bear on particular situations. So I particularly enjoyed that. This is a question that Dan gave me from the question box yesterday. So I'll just read the question. The best of the secular is close to Christian thought. How is the best determined? In other words, there are many secular views and thoughts. By what benchmark is the secular views closest to Christian views measured to consider them the best? And I'm going to give you, I think, it may sound like an uninspired answer. It may sound a little bit boring, I'm not sure. But I'm going to give you the answer I think almost any philosopher would give you. And the answer is, how do we determine the difference between the best and the worst views? We use reason. We use logic. When you think of philosophy, I mean, the great philosophers and the great philosophical tradition, it's not simply people expressing opinions about things. In an odd kind of way, many of you are from science and some of you are from mathematics. Philosophy is a lot like mathematics. It's like doing mathematics with words. And it's not simply expressing views, ideas, attitudes in an eloquent way. Literature does that, and there's an important place for it. But philosophy tends to be logic-based. No philosopher will tell you that all arguments are equally valid, or equally sound, or equally true. And it's not simple. We can't come up with mathematical proof. We can't sort of come up with a proof that everybody agrees with. But nevertheless, it becomes very clear, if any of you have taken philosophy and have taken logic, it becomes very clear there are good ways of arguing and bad ways of arguing. And there are fallacies, and there are all sorts of problems that in logic, in formal logic, and what we call argumentation theory or informal logic, we applied arguments on anything to figure out whether they're good arguments. And I can't give you a course in logic here. I actually, I'm somewhat of a specialist in logic, but just rest assured that it's not a simple matter of what's somebody's opinion. So what do you do when you're in philosophy? You go through, philosophy is about arguments. There are premises and conclusions. You look at the premises. You try to figure out if they're reasonable, if they make sense in the light of human experience. You see if they add up together in a logical way to get to the conclusion that the person is proposing. Now, it's sort of in the nitty-gritty, in the details, you see that this really does start to work, and that there are better ways of explaining and understanding and justifying things. Think about a courtroom. In a courtroom, it's not arbitrary. I mean, if the court works properly, there are arguments in a courtroom, you know, the defense, the crown. In a way, philosophy works like that. It's not arbitrary. It's not up for grabs. There are standards of evidence. There are standards of logical implication and so on and so forth. So it's not a free-for-all, and it's not opinion. The second thing I want to say is maybe I can talk a little bit about St. Augustine. St. Augustine famously said that understanding follows belief. We have the idea in modern society, partly because of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, we want to prove things. So we want to prove something, then we'll believe it. In fact, that's sort of the Enlightenment mantra. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to have a scientific hypothesis. We're going to do an experiment, and then we're going to figure out, and we're going to prove, see where the evidence is. Augustine said, and Augustine is a Christian thinker. He's a Neoplatonist. He was, in his young age, very involved with Plato's philosophy. And he came up with this neat idea. The idea when you're talking about religion or faith is not, I mean, we need to start with faith, which faith isn't argument, it isn't reason, it isn't logic. But once you believe, then you can understand. So understanding follows belief. You have religious belief, religious faith, and then you can make sense of the world. So in a way, you know, our modern age, it's all prove this. I won't believe until you prove it. What Augustine says is no, believe, and then after you believe, then all these puzzles, all the confusions, all the worries about what the meaning of life is and what's moral and so on and forth, all of a sudden you'll start to find that you have an answer. The ultimate, I've talked to some of you about this, the ultimate reason for having Christianity or faith or religion over and beyond science is that it gives the fullest possible explanation of the world. Human experience is such, we experience things, for example, like love. And so if you have a philosophy that can't explain what love is, why people love one another, why people sacrifice themselves for one another, why people are altruistic, then you've got a philosophy that's got a problem. If it can explain all physics and all chemistry and all biology, but it can't explain love, that's an important part of the human experience. An important part of the human experience is conscience. We intuitively, I don't mean by intuition a feeling, but we rationally discern some things are good, some things are bad. And what we need, we don't want a philosophy of life, a worldview, not a specialized little philosophy that deals with, I don't know, that deals with physics or deals with this problem of epistemology or metaphysics, but a philosophy we can live by. We need the big picture. And without defending it, I don't have time here, but I would simply suggest that the thing about religion, the thing about Christianity, it gives you the complete picture. So that it follows logically. When you believe, then all of a sudden things start to make sense. You can have meaning in your life. You can understand human aspiration. You can understand things like what is this thing called a soul that people talk about down through the ages and how we think and free will and all sorts of things. It sort of settles into place and makes sense. But the short answer is, how do we find out which are the best philosophies? We use logic. We use reason. We sit back and we try to be fair and objective. We try to look at the truth of premises. We try to see if they really lead to the conclusions people say they lead to, and we go from there. And as I said yesterday, there's actually remarkable consensus in the tradition about what are the better ways. There are disagreements, but there's remarkable consensus about which are the better ways of looking at things. I just wanted to say a couple of things from discussing with people I thought were important to mention. And this is Philia Sophia. And of course, this is where we get the term philosophy, friendship of wisdom. Sophia is wisdom. We have two owls there. The owl is the symbol, I'm going to talk about the medical symbol, but the owl is the symbol of philosophy. Why? Because the owl can see in the dark. And what philosophy does, it's a discerning kind of thing, so that when it's hard to see, when there's darkness, what philosophy does, good philosophy, reason does, is it is able to look when it's dark and see what's really there. This is the fresco by Raphael that I talked about. I wanted to, and I'm going to come back to this. The person or the muse on the highest pedestal is prudence, but let me use a Greek word. The Greek word is phronesis. It's practical wisdom. It's sort of how you deal with the world in an intelligent way. I think the doctor sitting on the couch yesterday all gave a good display of that. Aristotle thinks that what you need in the world is you need an intelligence that applies to particular circumstances. What do you need for that? You need judgment. And listening to people talk, I just wanted to emphasize, and then I'm going to talk about this at the end, but we're looking for simple answers. You know, a kind of a cutout cookie answer, a recipe, a template, a mechanical answer to, for example, difficult moral problems, difficult religious problems, the problem of evil, how come someone suffers and whatever. Aristotle thinks that you have to develop judgment. There isn't any simple, straightforward, black and white answer to the complexities of life. So Aristotle talks about ethics applied to particular individual circumstances, and you have to sort of take everything in, and you have to develop this sense of judgment where you are moral, and in our case, where you are authentically and faithfully Christian. But it's a matter of judgment, and it builds up slowly over a long period of time. That's why in previous ages, people respected old people. Aristotle says he has what I call the good granny. He talks about the good granny syndrome. Your grandmother who's never been to university, who's never read a philosophy book, but who's a really good person and has lived a long time. You talk to her, and she says the right answer. You ask her for advice about morality, and Aristotle said, oh, it's all surprising. She didn't learn from reading books. She learned from experience and from being a good person. And by being a good person, you learn to develop this kind of judgment. There's no simple answer to some of these complicated questions, but what you have to aim at is slowly. You get older, you think about things, you're prayerful, you read the Bible, you're logical, and you develop a kind of judgment. And then some surprising thing happens in your practice, and you scratch your head, but you've developed a kind of judgment that can deal with that. But there's no simple black and white answer to these questions. There's no mathematical formula or logical formula that I can give you or that any philosopher can give you. You just, slot in the values, and that's the answer. So that's why we need phronesis, practical wisdom, and she's at the top because that's, for Aristotle, the cardinal, the best virtue, the most important virtue, but I'm going to say something about that at the end. This is actually, I think I'll just, because I'm a little bit worried about time, let's go back to love. I want to talk about love, and I want to talk about medicine. This is, again, the quote from the Symposium. And I want to point out, again, this is from listening to people talk, and I thought it's important to say, this is Socrates, who's a very admirable character, and he's at this drinking party, and he talks about this mystical ladder where you go up. In our terms, you could say you contemplate God. So beauty at the top, beauty in itself, pure beauty, the absolute beauty. You raise yourself up through thought, through philosophy, through thinking, and you get above the sensual, the physical, and you effectively contemplate God. There is a problem with Socrates' view and with Plato's view, and there is a way in which Christianity, I think, is a little bit better. This is, Immanuel Kant came up with a categorical imperative. When you talk about medical ethics, I'm sure you'll talk about deontology. You've got a deontological code in medicine. That means duty. And Immanuel Kant, he was sort of a secular Christian. He grew up as a pietist. He believed in God, but he's an Enlightenment thinker. He sort of distanced himself also from the church. He has what's called the categorical imperative. And it's basically the moral rules we're supposed to live by. And one of the imperatives, which is very deep and insightful, is about personhood. And it's about treating every individual as a person. Everything has a price or a dignity. Whatever has a price can be replaced by something else equivalent. Whatever, by contrast, is exalted above all price and so admits of no equivalent has dignity. What's he talking about? Kant says there are people, persons, and there are objects. Objects we can buy and sell. We can put a value on them. Persons, human beings, every single human being has dignity and is infinitely valuable. Now, Kant, as I said, he's a bit of an alienated Christian. He's a Christian, but he's got his issues with Christianity. But what I want to say is this emphasis on the particular person, that comes from Christianity. What's great about Christianity, philosophers have a real hard time with, loving Jemmy because she's Jemmy. Philosophers are like scientists. They like big theories that are universal, that tell us how to deal with all human beings, or all this, or all that, or whatever. But what Christianity does is it says that every single individual person, because they're unique, because they're themselves. I can talk about being unique, see, because I'm an identical triplet. And all my life, people talk to me about me being a copy of somebody else. No, it's not like that. But this sort of insight that what's important about people is their own individuality. And every person, no matter how young, no matter how old, no matter how sick, no matter if they've got AIDS or if they're leading a promiscuous life or if they hate Christianity, every person has dignity and value. That comes from Christianity. So you've got Socrates. He's got this kind of abstract sort of view where he talks about something called the form of the good. It's like this universe, but it's not catching or not sort of clicking into this ultimately Christian idea that individual human beings are person. Every person is in the image of God. Every person is in some sense an alter Christus, another Christ. And this is one way in which I think Christianity adds to the philosophical tradition and gives us actually even the secular view today, for example, which emphasizes human rights. This comes from Christianity. Actually, it comes from medieval monks who first brought in an idea of rights. I won't go into it, but that idea that the individual is so important, and that's why we have to respect individual autonomy and individual choice. In a way, that's a Christian insight. So let's talk about medicine. I worry, It's funny because I go to philosophy conferences. They're very different from a conference like this. And philosophers are all worried about tiny little Greek words and, little distinctions about arguments and whatever. But you're more interested in medicine. So I want to talk a little bit about the beginnings of medicine. I want to talk about the Hippocratic Oath. And then I want to say that Christianity there's something that may seem to be to philosophers is sort of missing in Christianity, and in fact, it's pointing to something else, which is what we're talking about today, which is ultimately love. But so here's a little Greek. I won't go into it, but it's the Greeks practiced medicine. They were. I would think for the ancient world pretty good at it. They had surgery and all sorts of interesting things. This is a copy of papyrus of the Hippocratic Oath in Greek. I've translated here for you. There's one word I want you to notice and I want to talk about. So this is my own translation. Chaste and holy will I conduct my life and my craft. And of course, the ancient Greeks weren't Christians. They didn't know, they didn't have the revelation that we have. But notice, those words are chaste and holy. So there's a sense here, there's something sacred. There's a religious obligation here that one has to be pious. Piety was really important to the Greeks. And pious means being respectful of the gods. And so we've got this little fragment of papyrus. I'm sorry, I'm too tired. Techne, this word here. That's what I want you to notice. That word, techne, is a word, it's where we get our word technical, our word technology. It's the Greek word for art, or for craft, or for skill. And the idea here is you're going to be chaste and holy and do what the gods want in a good sense and take care of sick people and do good in the world. And you're going to do it, why? Because you've learned a certain skill, a certain techne, a certain technique. And what is that? Aristotle says it's reason applied to a particular task. Art in Greek culture, it means everything. It means making shoes is an art. Making a sculpture. Painting a painting is art. Arguing is an art. And medicine is an art. And the way Greek medicine worked is that there were little schools of philosophers, really, that had a certain worldview, a view of life. Hippocratic is just one school of Greek medicine. And when we were talking about C.S. Lewis, they had a sort of a closely knit, almost family-like arrangement, storge, this sort of loyalty to this particular school. And as we see in the Hippocratic Oath, they taught and they passed, sort of like apprentices. They passed down the medical skills from, usually in families, so you'd have children and you'd pass on the medical knowledge to your children. Maybe you're taking some more apprentices. It was like a big family, and oftentimes there were secret kinds of, knowledge that they kept among themselves and so on and so forth. But techne, that's the word I want you to notice. This is Asclepius, who was the Greek god of medicine. I just thought that might be fun for you, the Association Médicale Canadienne. The snake on the rod, which is the universal symbol of medicine. We're not really sure why that became associated with medicine. The thought is that in ancient Greek times, medicine, at the beginning, it was mixed with a certain kind of worship. There were temples. When you wanted to get healed, you would go to a temple, and some of these temples, for some reason or not, they had snakes, non-venomous snakes. We're not exactly sure why. The thought is it's because a snake sheds its skin and starts its life all over. And the idea is that what medicine does, it takes somebody who's sick, who's ill, who's in a bad way, and if you do the medical care properly, you, in some sense, renew that person. You give them a new life, like a snake that's somehow shedding its old skin. Actually, this is from the Symposium. This is Socrates. Actually, it's not from the Symposium. It's from the Phaedo. Sorry, that's a mistake. But this is Socrates before he's dying. And notice he says he wants to offer a sacrifice to Asclepius. Crido, we owe a cock to Asclepius, but you pay up and don't fail to take care. And then he dies. And the thought is what Socrates is saying already here, even though it's not Christian, but Socrates thinks that there's another life to come. And so, in a way, he's being cured of all the present earthly ills, all the suffering. He's going to a better life. He's going to shed his body. His soul's going to be liberated. And so he asks his friend, oh, by the way, pay homage to the gods because I'm being cured of all human infirmity. And I'm going to a better place, a place that's effectively like a kind of paradise. But okay, so I want to talk about two things. I want to go back and talk about the Symposium. And in the Symposium, this drinking party, there is a character who's a doctor. So I thought for you guys, it's kind of fun to talk about. He's not the main character. And what happens in the Symposium, so we're all having a drinking party, everybody has to make a speech. So we say, okay, we're going to talk about love. That's what this is. Okay, everybody has to make a speech about love. And so you get all these people together. Eryximachus is the name of the doctor. And notice what he says. The science of medicine is completely governed by love. Now, I actually think that Christianity pushes this even further in sort of in a higher, in a more elevated direction. But it's kind of interesting that already we've got this doctor. What they're trying to explain is love, and in particular, we talked about Eros. They're trying to explain this kind of beauty. So he's trying to explain how medicine works. Love, he says, isn't only a human mental response to physical attractions. The body of every creature on earth is pervaded by love, as is every plant too. It's hardly going too far to say that love is present in everything that exists. And his idea is, the Greeks believed in elements, okay? So the world was made up of things like wet and dry, hot and cold, sweet and sour, light and dark. Somehow there were all these binary opposites. And the way that life worked is that there was a harmony between opposites. And the point of medicine was to, when you've got a body that's ill, somebody's too hot, somebody's too wet, somebody's jaundiced, the wrong color, the point of medicine is to reestablish the harmony that should exist between those different elements. Medicine is the science of love as it affects bodily functions. And they really thought of chemistry, physics in this kind of way. You know, you've heard of the four elements: fire, earth, water, air. And Greek science is all about these things mixing in opposite pairs in the right way. So he says, he's talking that physically, the way the physiology works is a matter of love. It's of things that desire one another in the right kind of way. A true doctor knows how to make a body gain a love which it should have, and rid itself of a love it shouldn't have. He should be able to reconcile the extremes of hostility between the elements and make them love one another. So, for example, hot and cold. They're opposites. They fight with one another. What we need in a healthy person, with a healthy body, is we have to somehow reconcile them so that they love one another. Because he thinks that the world is made up of elements that are opposites, and that a living body is made up of these opposites that are that pull each other apart. And what we have to do is we have to have them in the right harmony, the right balance. And what the doctor is doing is reestablishing that harmony. Think of humors. That's a little bit, again, in the Greek way. That, this is early medicine. And so what you want is basically the body, human health is made up of different things that have to be balanced and harmonious with one another.
But why is he calling them loves?
Because he thinks that the universe is pervaded by love, and there has to be a proper kind of harmony. They shouldn't fight with one another. What's happening in a sick person... Yeah, well, love is it's an erotic attraction, not necessarily sexual, but the thing is that he thinks think of a room filled with people. For it to work well, those people have to love one another in the right kind of way. If they're all at odds with one another, then the room's a mess. Then, we can't get anything done. Then there's disorder, whatever. The body's like that. And so what we have to do, I'm not going to focus on the science here, but what we have to do as doctors is we have to go in and reestablish that there's some kind of peaceful desire and attraction and appreciation of the different elements for one another. I like to emphasize the art of medicine. two kinds of love, and he's using the term eros, are inherent in the body. The love experienced by a healthy body or a sick body is different. Others have said that it is all right to gratify good people and wrong to gratify the self-indulgent. That's the term I mentioned yesterday, akolasia. Self-indulgent people, and the situation with the human body is precisely analogous. The interesting thing is that what he says is, eros isn't bad, it's good. We need things to cling together, to cohere, to care for one another. What's important is what the desire is. And so, for example, you smoke, or you take heroin, you take drugs, you have a sexual addiction, whatever. It's not love, unqualified eros that matters. What you need is eros directed to the right things in moderation. That's a love that's directed by a certain kind of intelligence. This is eros, but it's not being a libertine, sort of letting yourself do anything, desiring anything. The whole point of medicine is to take a body and to make the body love the right kind of thing and, in a way, hate the right kind of thing. So there's a sense there that really there's a sense that love is good. This eros is good, but again, it has to be directed by something higher, which I will talk about in a minute. I've noticed as a result of practicing medicine professionally that love is a great and awesome God who pervades every aspect of the lives of men and gods. That's, I talked about C.S. Lewis and the four loves. My problem with C.S. Lewis is that these loves sort of overlap. They don't, it's not, you really can't, you can't really separate them out in Greek thought. Notice, love is a great and awesome God. What does that sound like? Well, I did put a little scripture in. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. It's surprising, but in some sense what Eryximachus wants to say is that the way to understand the world is that there's this desire, this care, this affection, this clinging to one another. It operates all the way down to the physical level, but it also operates on a higher level. And of course, the point of medicine on another level is caring for other people, loving for other people. Certainly as Christian physicians, I think that's what's going to be motivating you. Yeah, I mean, he's being literary and perhaps metaphorical, and he's being scientific at the same time. He's not a Christian, right? This is ancient Greek philosophy, 400 years before Christ. But nevertheless, you have this idea among somebody who's a doctor. He's talking to a bunch of these people, and he's saying, really, what medicine is about love. Even just health is about love. It's about having the right kind of love. The right love that's directed in the right way, in a way that reconciles opposites and that brings harmony into the world. And of course, the whole profession itself, he says, he gives this sort of a medium lengthy speech, is directed by this concern for others. But yes, Dan, you could sort of turn it into a Christian. I think you can take Christianity and you can go look back and you can understand this stuff better. And then there's a whole sort of vocabulary that comes from Christianity and the Bible and Scripture and theology that we can use to expand on that and make more sense of it. But I want to shift then. So that's just a little glimpse at Greek medicine. And so remember, the Hippocratic Oath, techne, and which is what all of you are studying and why you're so busy and tired and, hitting the books. The word techne, so skill, being good at something, having some expertise, being an expert, being technically proficient. The interesting thing is, in the Bible, in the New Testament, they don't use the word techne. This is just a little article on the New Testament and the Old Testament, and basically talking about Hebrew and Greek vocabulary. So the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, which is a simpler Greek. It's sort of, it was the international idiom at the time. The philosophical Greek is much more complicated, much more difficult, hard to understand. The biblical Greek is pretty straightforward, pretty down to earth. It's not that hard to get a grasp on it. And here's this word that's in common usage, techne, and you don't find it in the New Testament in particular, which is interesting to us. So this is Susan Gillingham. What counted as the arts, this is an article about arts, techne is arts, in the biblical world. An equivalent Greek word, techne, occurs just once in the New Testament. And here it refers to the representative art of pagan cultures. So in the New Testament, the only time they use the Greek word for skill, for expertise, for science, for art, is when in one little passage where they're talking about the art of the pagans. Now, for a philosopher, this is really strange. Why is it strange? Well, because what all these philosophers are trying to do when they're trying to do ethics is, in a way, they're trying to develop a skill, we call it virtue, or morality, a skill. Here's a rational way in which you can make sense of the world, an intelligent way you can apply reason to your lives, and you can figure out how to act like a good person in particular circumstance. And yet the New Testament, which it's all about, I think, religion, which is something a little bit different than morality, but it's also about virtue in some sense, and yet they never talk about techne, art, skill. This is in the Christian tradition. This is St. Benedict. This is the first time the word techne starts to come back. And this is in Benedict's rule, which was for monks. And in one part of the rule, a method of life. He wanted to teach his monks how you should live as a Christian. I'll show you in a second a page from it. He asked, what is the holy art? Ars sancta, which is just the Latin for techne. So the ars is the Latin equivalent of techne. And he asked, what's the holy art which the abbot taught to teach his disciples? And it's not very complicated. It's not very surprising. Here's what he thinks is the art. And don't worry, we're not going to look at it all, but what does he do? He has a whole list of rules. Follow these rules. Follow this rule, this rule, this rule, this rule. And he provides sort of a recipe, a template, a guide, which if you follow it, then presto, you're going to be a good Christian. It's very edifying. You know, he starts off, first love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and all your strength, and love your neighbor of yourself. It's very biblical, very scriptural. But, you know, he goes down and in very specific detail, clothe the naked, relieve the lot of the poor, visit the sick, bury the dead, go to help the troubled, go console the sorry. And you basically have sort of, again, a template, a prescription, your doctors, okay? A prescription. Follow this and you can be holy and you can be a Christian. This is the first time that the word art in terms of skill, so this is the holy skill. This is the holy method, the holy technique. This is how you become holy. But again, this is not in the New Testament. Why is it not in the New Testament? Well, I enjoyed the singing, the song. It was nice. I made a request. We sang Amazing Grace. Because what happens in the New Testament is it's grace that makes us good. It's grace that makes us moral. It's grace that makes us righteous. There's the idea in Christianity that what we need is, we don't need just a recipe, a template. It's not like when you're studying how to do something in medicine and you're learning how to, I don't know, how to replace a knee like my daughter does, and it's very technical, and there are rules or instructions, and you follow it and to the T, and you do it well, whatever. That's not what Christianity is about. It's important to be technically skilled. You all have to be good doctors, but what do we need to be good people, to be skilled at virtue, to be skilled at religion? We need grace. Where does that grace come from? Well, I showed you the picture of from Raphael with prudence, right? Or phronesis as the highest virtue for Aristotle. We talked about Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas comes in, he says the theological virtues. You know what he replaces prudence with? He replaces it with something else. He replaces it with love. And he says, in effect, in the Christian tradition, technique, learning a skill, expertise, again, having a method, a template, a recipe, that's not what is the foundation of everything. The foundation, he says, it's not even reason or intelligence. It's not phronesis, it's love. And love has to direct the technique. Love is where everything starts and where everything begins. It's not that skill, art, craft, method, it's not that it's not important. Being doctors, and the Hippocratic Oath is all about that. You're going to learn this skill. But that skill is useless if it's not directed by something higher. Well, Aristotle would say it should be directed by practical wisdom. What Christianity says, it has to be directed by love. And love is very difficult, and it's very hard. Believe me, if you live a long life, it's arduous, it's difficult. But we have grace. Grace, again, which is not a technique, which is not something you can memorize. You go home and you memorize your textbook, and then you can give the right answer. It's not like that. There's some kind of higher power. There's some kind of heavenly aid, which is what that song, Amazing Grace, is about, which has to come from above and fill you up. And then in this transcendental, this spiritual, this supernatural way, that's what allows us to take the technique, the skill, and, become good doctors or good professors or good policemen or good lawyers or whatever. So I wanted to leave you with the idea that, and it's interesting, philosophy and theology, and again, I'm really a philosopher, not a theologian, philosophers are all concerned with technique. The early philosophers, and some of the philosophers I've shown you, they're moral people. They're trying to find out what's good. They're using logic. They're coming out with arguments. They say many things that are compatible or can be reconciled, or even are intimations of Christianity, but they're focusing on the technique. And what Christianity says, you need something more than technique. You need this higher help, this power, this grace, this love. Because I'm an ethicist, you're all going to be doctors. This is just a little list of the ways we think about ethics in contemporary moral philosophy, virtue ethics, natural law. Virtue ethics, the idea is your character. That's what you have to develop to become a good person. Natural law, the idea that there's some sense of right and wrong inside every person, and being moral is following that. Divine command, morality, for religious people who sort of say, okay, what is it? It's following the 10 Commandments. God gives us commands. We have to follow them. Deontology, Immanuel Kant, the notion of duty. Utilitarianism, which for Christians starts to be a little bit problematic. But basically the idea that we have to act so as to increase the happiness of everyone. Liberalism, which causes so many problems in a way today, but nevertheless, which is based on the dignity of the individual person and on a respect for choice and for what people decide for themselves. Even feminism, which actually feminist ethics is based on care, on caring for other people. And what I want to say is none of this works, just like none of the technique, none of this go, unless what? Unless it's sort of raised up, lifted up by some kind of something other than what the philosophers are able to get at, which is grace. This grace that comes from God, which allows us to do what? Not only to be intelligence. Intelligence isn't enough by itself. You can be a very intelligent doctor. You can be very smart. You can, know the technique, be very skilled, and you can do horrible things in the world. And you can be a very immoral person. So you need the technique, of course. It's a necessary condition for being a good doctor, but it's not enough. We need this other thing. And because the New Testament is not focusing on the technique, it's focusing on what is ultimately more important, this other aspect of our lives, this need for this kind of love that ultimately only comes from a completely forgiving God and is above us. That's what the New Testament is about. It's not saying that you shouldn't have skill, you shouldn't have expertise, but that's not what it's about. And being a doctor, what you need is you need the technique, but then you need the other thing, this unconditional love. And where does it come from? Well, you're very fortunate because you're all Christians. And so the Christian religion, I think, very effectively, more effectively than anything else, is able to emphasize and to communicate the importance of that. So that's all, I think, Dan, that I had to say today. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ethics. That's an important thing to talk about. And you're all doctors, and you may have difficult situations you have to deal with. Let me talk about it from the viewpoint as an ethicist, what I see going on. And to be fair, there's good and there's bad. But the practice of biomedical ethics today, I think from a Christian viewpoint, is very problematic and worrisome. But what's the kernel, the seed of the idea that what do biomedical ethicists do? The big emphasis is on consent. The big emphasis today is on liberalism. Liberalism comes from Christianity. It comes from the idea that in the ancient world, nobody thought everybody was equal or everybody had equal worth or everybody had dignity. It comes from the Christian idea that everybody is somehow in the image of God, that everybody is precious, that everybody deserves a hearing, that everybody has to be respected. And so this liberal emphasis on individuals, I think it would have been unthinkable without the Christian tradition. In the ancient world, and even the medieval world, what mattered was the collectivity. You were part of a group. You were an Athenian, or you were a Roman, or you belonged to a particular group, and it wasn't so much the particular person you were, but that loyalty, that appartenance, that actually, the term in Greek is piety. The piety was, so Socrates, he doesn't save his life. He stays in Athens and he dies. Why? Because he can't leave Athens. The worst punishment in the ancient world is exile, when you're pushed away from your community, when your family, because you're nobody anymore. And Christianity comes along, I showed you Kant, and it basically says, no, every individual, even if you're separated, even if you're in solitary confinement in Kingston Pen and you're there for 10 years, you're still in the image of God, you're still important, you're still in some sense equally valuable. And liberalism takes that and says, hey, we have to take people seriously. That's the good side. The problem, Terry, and I have to be honest, I'm not a doctor, and I teach ethics. I teach nursing ethics. And sometimes people come to me for advice. The problem with ethics, the way it's practiced, for example, in the hospital setting today, is that the emphasis tends to be exclusively on autonomy. So the question becomes, what does this person believe? And whatever their beliefs are, they could have crazy beliefs, they could have, toxic beliefs, beliefs that are unhealthy, beliefs that are self-destructive. So the idea is, when you're teaching ethics, when you're teaching morality, when I teach ethics to my students, well, let's be honest, I'm the authority. I don't tell them what to think, but they revere me in some sense as an authority, and I know the material, and I can sort of point and be helpful, and okay, we're trying to figure out what's ethical. Well, you think that's ethical? Just a minute now. Let's look logically where that leads, whatever. But what's happening in society with the euthanasia stuff, with the abortion stuff, cosmetic surgery with some of that stuff, it basically depends on what the person decides and what the person believes. If we have a confused society where there's all sorts of crazy values running around,
everybody's his own prophet.
Absolutely. And so what's happened, excuse me, I don't want to be rude, but I'll tell you what one of my colleagues said. It's a little bit rude, excuse me, but he said, well, what's a bioethicist? It's everybody's favorite whore. What did he mean by that? So everybody's favorite product. The trouble with the bioethics as it's practiced now is somebody comes in and they don't give any guidance. People need guidance. People are mixed up. They're confused. They're lost, whatever. So they need, but the way society has turned, with the emphasis on individual rights, on consent, what people come in, well, what do you believe? So for example, what's going to happen with the euthanasia legislation is, people aren't going to say, hey, well, maybe that's not a good thing to do. Hey, just a minute, stop and think about this. Have you done that? Because that involves instruction, that involves, Jesus came and he said, they said of him, he taught with authority. We don't like authority. Authority's bad. Authority's bad. It's oppressive. It's pushing us down. And so that's the problem. And, I can't emphasize this enough. You may not realize it. You're young. You're just starting. You're important people. Because what happens inside, Dan said this when on the couch, because you're professionals, because you're doctors, people are going to look up to you. As soon as you become a doctor, you become a demigod, sort of, to use a Greek term. People look up to you, they respect your opinion. Most people don't know much about life, don't know much about health, don't know much about morality. And then you come in and you're the authority, and they look up to you. And it's not just in your practice. They ask you to sit, oh, well, we're having a commission on this. Could you come? We need a doctor to come and say, oh, could you come and talk to the high school? Oh, could you come to, there's the ethics class at the university. And you will become very important. The problem, Terry, it's exactly what you're saying. You're spot on. The problem is we're in a society where authority is bad. Imagine you have a patient and they come in, I was talking to some of you about this, and you just do what the patient says. That's absurd. What you need to have medicine work properly, you need someone who's in charge, you guys, because you're the experts, and then we listen to you, we the patients, and then you inform. In ethics, we need some of that too, but it's not really allowed. You're not allowed, even in a gentle way, to try and give guidance. And so the problem is that when my colleague said the bioethicist is everybody's whore, he meant that the bioethicist will, excuse me, again, it's a bit of a rude comparison. A prostitute will sleep with anybody. And the bioethicist says, okay, if you're a Hindu or if you're an atheist or if you're a Christian, it doesn't matter what you are. He basically just said, let's clarify, what do you believe? Okay, and you could have crazy beliefs. You could have wrong beliefs that just don't make any sense, that are illogical, but that's what you believe. Okay, so that's what we'll do. And that's where we've gotten. I think there's a bigger issue in society. Maybe some of you will be politically active. It's good to be politically active, by the way, because politics brings, it attracts all sorts of the wrong kinds of people. But we have a big problem in our society and we're living the lie in a way, because we pretend we don't need guidance. We do need guidance. We pretend that there's no authority. I'm at the university, of course there's authority. I mark students. I am an authority. I decide whether you're getting an A or whether you're failing, whatever. Authority is always with us. But in the present context and in medical ethics, what's happened is it's the rights of the individual. And there's something good about that. It's not all bad, but it's gone too far. You have to be realistic about the world. Like, you could hope that the world is all good and that the world is all Christian, that everybody's moral and that everybody's smart and makes good. The world isn't like that. What I want to first say, Terry, is that I'm sorry that I have to say this, but it's going to be hard to talk to a bioethicist. Why? Well, we philosophers, like you doctors, you know all sorts of technical distinctions about the body and physiology and necrosis. Somebody was showing me yesterday, my God. But philosophers have a technical vocabulary too, and they know logic. And when you've got somebody trained and they're going to come in, well, that's right. And what are they going to do? They're going to pull out their techne out of their pocket, and they're going to have all these distinctions, and you're going, well, what's this? And they're going to, and by the way, philosophers are good at talking. They're good at arguing. And so but don't be fazed by that. Don't be, any person that's got a PhD in philosophy, they've learned how to argue. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to deal with a bioethicist. And I want to go back to what Paul said yesterday. One of the problems is that many of these people, you may be surprised, but they don't really know the philosophical tradition. All that stuff I was showing you, what they focused in on is modern philosophy, and they have the view there's pro and con on every issue. You believe in God, you don't believe in God. Oh, there's just as many reasons for, there's just as many reasons against. What does philosophy do? It's kind of a referee. It looks at the logic on this side, the logic on this side. And then what happens? You decide. Okay, ethically, you want to have assisted suicide? Well, there's the reasons on this side. There's the reason on this side. I'll tell you a true story. I thought this was abhorrent. It still gives me the shivers. I knew somebody when I was in grad school, and he was specializing in ethics, and he told me this story. And he wasn't regretful about it. He was in Scotland, and he was one of these ethicists that emphasizes autonomy and, sort of pulls away. He had a friend. His friend came to see him in the evening, and I said, well, he asked him what he thought about suicide. And this guy was an ethicist, so he put out the arguments for and against. The next day, his friend went out and committed suicide. That's not, to me, ethics. This guy was not at all ashamed of this, did not feel guilty about it. He gave the guys the reasons, whatever. To me, that's not ethics, because ethics needs to give guidance, sound, good guidance to help people be more. It's hard to be more. It's even hard sometimes, as you guys on the couch were saying, it's hard to figure out what's the best way to act in this situation. But all I can say is you just have to bring your faith, your love, your intelligence to bear on the world as professionals. It's going to be an uphill battle. Maybe society is eventually going to sort of swing back the other way. That's often what happens. The pendulum goes from one side to the other. But you're touching on a problem that's a real problem, Terry, and I can't pretend that it's not a problem. What should you do? Here's one thing that I suggest that you all do. Not right now, because you're way too busy. Read great literature. Read great philosophy. When you have time, become a cultured person. I don't know if Wei is here. I mean, yes, there he is. So this man has a degree in liberal arts. I said to him, and I think it's true, there is a Western culture, a Christian culture filled with literature, filled with great thinkers that say, spend some time reading that. It will equip you. in a way to deal with some of these issues. You won't have time to do technical philosophy, technical ethics, technical logic. I wouldn't worry so much about that. If you come through the tradition, you read Tolstoy, you read Dostoevsky, you read the Bible, you read St. Augustine, you read Thomas Aquinas, and when you have some time, I know you don't have any time right now, so that medical technique is filled up with something else that has to do with values, that has to do with what does it mean to be a human being? What is human nature? What is it to be good? What's God? What happens there? All those big questions. There's a big literature out there. Paul went to Tyndale College and in a way did a master's degree and talked about all this stuff. That's a good way to get a grip on ethics and to deal with medical ethicists. But most of them don't have that background. They're trained in a very narrow specialist way. They're experts, they have a technique, but it's really, ultimately, it comes down, in their mind, it's a kind of impoverished liberalism. Liberalism isn't all bad, guys. We're all liberals. We all believe. I don't want someone telling me I can't go to the church that I want. It's important, the individual choice. But in our modern society right now, in contemporary society, we've kind of gone off the deep end. And the problem you're talking about is it's out there. And the rest of you, when you practice, and you practice with old people, or you practice, in a hospital. My daughter is telling me, who's a surgeon, about issues that come up. I can't pretend it's easy. So, but there is a tradition out there. It's in philosophy. The great thinkers of the past say things that are, I think Christianity, Eryximachus, the Platonic doctor there, Christianity gives you an even better way. That guy is trying to grasp at something about love and about medicine and about the world being held together in harmony by a good kind of desire. And I think what happens is Christianity comes again and he's able to make more sense of it than he made sense of it. And again, you're very fortunate because you're religious people. So most people don't have that. They're cut adrift. They're lost. They don't know what they're doing. But it's a difficult situation, Terry, and you make an excellent point.